Tonight, we are starting a new book. The book is Finding Genuine Practice, and it's by His Holiness the 17th Karmapa. And this book is a teaching on the 8 verses of mind training by Geshe Langri Thangpa. He was a predecessor of Chekawa, who took the mind training teachings and put them into the 59 slogans of the 7 points of mind training. But this had not been done when these 8 verses were written. These come from the Kadampa tradition, as the Karmapa points out. And what's interesting about the Kadampa tradition is that it has been incorporated into all the 4 main lineages in Tibetan Buddhism to the point that it ceased to be a distinct separate lineage. So you do not have the traditional Kadampa lineage in existence today. Now, Geshe Kelsang, a number of years ago, he started the new Kadampa tradition, but it was not a continuation of the old one. He was kind of a rebel, quite honestly, Geshe Kelsang, but I won't go into that anymore. Um, so in the preface here, we have a little bit of information about the mind training teachings. And they were brought to Tibet from India by Atisha. And he practiced these mind training teachings very thoroughly. It was his main teaching. And one of the stories, and there are lots of stories about him, but I think it's worth repeating, that he was concerned because he had heard good things about the people of Tibet, and he was concerned when he got there if he would have uh, enough people to cause him difficulties and so forth, irritation and so forth, so he could practice these slogans or these teachings of mind training. Because if people are nice to you, then you don't really learn how to have patience, and so on and so forth. And so he was reputed to have brought an unruly Bengali servant with him that would cause him, help him develop patience. He did say later on, after being in Tibet for quite a while, that he didn't need to bring that servant, that the Tibetan people were plenty much of a problem too. So I guess the point of that story is that no matter where you go, there are difficult people. And that is one of the wonderful things about mind training because it utilizes difficult people in difficult situations. Now, in the introduction, it says that these 8 verses of mind training is probably the first uh, practice that was open widely to the public. Before that, it wasn't shared other than with a few students. But this was intended for the public, for anybody who wanted to practice it. So these teachings came to these Kadampa teachings, and not just the 7 points of mind training, There are a lot of other teachings that are included in the Kadampa tradition, and many of them involve slogans. So these 7 points of mind training slogans you might say it's not a unique way to teach. In the Kadampa tradition, they would have slogans for all kinds of different teachings. So Gampopa, the story about Gampopa is that he was married and he was a doctor, and there was a plague, not necessarily bubonic plague, but a disease, an epidemic that swept through the area, and his wife got sick, and she was on her deathbed, and he could not cure her, and she was not, she was fighting dying. She was putting up a very good fight, you might say, but it was a losing fight. And Gampopa was getting a little concerned about how much she was suffering. And finally, he asked his wife, well, why don't you just let yourself die? And she said, well, I'm very attached to you. And you're very handsome and young. And I know that as soon as I'm gone, you'll have no trouble finding another woman to marry. And so Gampopa said, well, what can I do to help you ease your dying? And she said, take monastic vows and become a monk. And so he promised that he would become a monk. And he went to a Kadampa monastery then after a while and became a monk in the Kadampa tradition. So this is where he received his training in the 7 points of mind training and also these 8 verses. Now, what happened was after a long time, he went to seek Milarepa, and he did find Milarepa, and he became Milarepa's student. And so Gampopa then received the Mahamudra teachings that Milarepa had received from Marpa and back to Naropa and then Talopa, just like in the Mahamudra lineage supplication. So these Mahamudra teachings were passed on to Gampopa, and he took them and the Kadampa teachings in the monastic tradition and formed what is now the present Kagyu lineage. His main student was the first Karmapa. So that's how these Kadampa teachings came to be incorporated into the Kagyu lineage. Now, mind training means training in bodhicitta. And there are 2 aspects of bodhicitta. It is relative bodhicitta, which is training in compassion, and also absolute bodhicitta, which is emptiness. And the 8 verses primarily concentrate on relative bodhicitta, but also there is an element of absolute bodhicitta in them. So that's what is intended by writing these 8 verses, that this will help us strengthen and develop and mature our bodhicitta, our compassion for all beings, eventually encompassing all beings, and also to understand emptiness and the ultimate. These verses are not intended to be understood intellectually. They're not intended to be just pay lip service to them. They are intended to be put into practice. I like to use the term heart service, the difference between heart service and lip service. And so you might say that intellectually understanding them, it's all conceptual, and there's nothing experiential about it. But putting them into practice means that you are actually experiencing them. And this will help you develop. Whereas if it's just lip service or intellectual, you really won't develop from it. So it's very important to understand these teachings and put them into practice. It is recommended here that when you get up in the morning to examine what you have to do today. You might say set out with a plan. And then, of course, within that plan is to practice mind training throughout the day. And then in the evening before bed, reflect on how you did, how successful you were. And where you find that you fell short, instead of beating yourself up, just resolve to do better where you need to be improved. So it's kind of working with yourself with gentleness but firmness, encouraging yourself to improve when you see faults and shortcomings, but do it in a nurturing way. And the reason for this is that we need to bring a Dharma practice into our daily lives, that it's not just about sitting on the cushion. That is a big mistake, to compartmentalize your life, where you have your Buddhist life, which is when you're on the cushion doing one of these Zoom programs, maybe reading. But then when you go off to work, that's a whole different world that you are in, and what Dharma doesn't seem to arise much for you in that situation if you have this wrong approach. So now the introduction is rather short. In fact, I summarized it here in a very few words, that this teaching, the Karmapa, stresses how we need to bring our practice into our difficulties that we face in life, as well as our Dharma practice. And we're not alone, that all practitioners face the same issue. We all have difficulties, and we have to bring our practice and join our practice with our difficulties. And if we can do that, then we will ripen and mature, and that is excellent. We'll be less of a nuisance for ourselves and less of a nuisance for other people. So that's my summary of the introduction. Now the overview, it's really not called an overview, but I'm calling it an overview. It's on page 17. It starts on 17. That here he's talking about that we're training in bodhicitta, and this is really difficult to do. It's not easy. And as a result, it needs to be done gradually rather than trying to accomplish it all in a week or a month or a year. Little by little. And this takes courage, of course, because what we are doing, you might say, is when we're practicing these 8 verses, is we are insulting our ego. We're not letting it lead. And ego can be very, very uncomfortable and keep trying to get you to not practice these verses. So it takes courage to not listen to that inner voice and just keep on practicing. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche gave this example one time about how mind training works. And the analogy is a piece of paper that you have curled up into a cylinder very tightly. I'm not going to do it tightly, but here are the prayers that we do later. But if you would roll up a piece of paper like this and then make it really tight, when you unroll it, it will stay curled like that. And the way to uncurl it is to roll it up the other way and curl it very tight, like this, and then uncurl it, and it will lay flat. And so he was saying that this kind of goes, not only does it go against what our ego is telling us, but you could look at it as being a little extreme, only a little, but it is because we have, you might say, gone so far in the other extreme of cherishing ourselves so much. And again, this is why it's important to go slowly, because we have a lot of work to do. The Karmapa makes a distinction between the Hinayana, which is sometimes called the lesser vehicle, and the Mahayana, which is sometimes called the greater vehicle. Now, the lesser vehicle, the lesser means that you are working primarily with yourself. So you're working with fewer sentient beings. Therefore, it is lesser. And the Mahayana is called a greater vehicle because you're working with basically all sentient beings. Now, the Karmapa calls Hinayana the foundation, or the foundation path. And the reason why he does this is that the Hinayana is necessary, practicing it, as a foundation for the Mahayana. The Mahayana builds on whatever it is that you have learned when you're on the Hinayana path. He also mentions that even if you're doing Mahayana practices, if you have Hinayana motivation, it's still a Hinayana practice. So he says the distinction between the foundation and the Mahayana is the amount of responsibility. and the size of the burden that you are able to bear. That is what is important. You don't want to feel overwhelmed and then quit. And this is again where courage comes in. And His Holiness uses terms like this or questions like this to see how you are doing with these 8 verses. So one question that you can ask yourself is, how do you feel in your heart? Another is, can you treasure all sentient beings? And then to bring this up to our present situation in this country, I wrote down here, how about treasuring the person that you are not going to vote for in the coming election? Can you treasure that person? And if you remember, when we were reading In Love with the World by Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, he was talking about how uncomfortable he was on the train and in the Varanasi train station with these very poor, smelly, raggedy Indian people. So even he had difficulty in a situation like that. So this is about us being realistic about what we can take on, what we are willing to take on and carry through with. So he continues and says we need to train in the Hinayana practices in order to become Mahayana practitioners. That the Hinayana allows us to work primarily with ourselves, and as a result of that work, tame somewhat our minds and our negative habitual patterns. And with that basis, then we become able to travel the Mahayana path. To put it very simply, the way to know when you're ready for the Mahayana path is that you are suffering less than when you came to Buddhism, that your mind is calmer, and that you're more aware of the suffering of others. It also helps if you want to do something to alleviate the suffering of others now that you're more aware of it. So the motivation that we have when we are doing practices is very, very important, and it determines whether we are doing a Mahayana or a Hinayana practice. If you are genuinely doing the practice so that you can be of benefit to all beings, then that is the Mahayana motivation. That is bodhicitta. But without that kind of motivation, this text becomes a Hinayana text. So he finishes it up by saying that we need to look inward and examine our mind and our intention. Here is a quote at the end of that section. When we talk about training the mind, we mean we are improving our own mind, seeing whether we have been able to focus inwards and tame and pacify our own wild way of being. That is what is important. That is what is important. I'll repeat that. So now on to chapter 1. And it begins on page 24. So here are the first 4 lines of these instructions here. By thinking of all sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, for accomplishing the highest aim, I will always hold them dear. Now, he started out in this section by talking about a wish-fulfilling jewel, and this was new to me. I had not heard this story about the source of a wish-fulfilling jewel. So it is extremely difficult to obtain, and you have to go looking in the ocean for it, that the Nagas hide them in the ocean. And so you have a long ocean voyage to get to the king of the Nagas and get it from him. So Karmapa continues that according to the myth, and he uses the word myth here, that once you find the jewel and pray and make offerings to it, it fulfills all your desires. So I thought that was very concise teaching on a wish-fulfilling jewel, which are alluded to in frequent places in the Dharma. So the Karmapa thinks a little bit about what would be a modern analogy to the wish-fulfilling jewel that would not be a myth. Oh, and I should say that the wish-fulfilling jewel then will fulfill all of your desires. That's why it's called wish-fulfilling. If you pray to it, make offerings to it, and so forth, treat it with respect. So, Karmapa said that what he sees is that the closest thing in our experience is money, that we equate money with happiness rather than as a means to happiness. And so he interprets that to mean in these 4 lines, first 4 lines, that we need to treat all sentient beings as more important than money to us. That money can't develop our compassion or give us wisdom. So to read those lines again, by thinking of all sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, for accomplishing the highest aim, I will always hold them dear. So see them as more important than money. Here is a quote of his. What this verse is saying is that in order for us to bring ourselves happiness and accomplish the state of Buddhahood, we must understand there is no difference between Buddhas and sentient beings. So he goes into an examination or a comparison. He uses the analogy of clay so that we can see that if we look deeply, that all sentient beings are similar. If we look shallow and do a shallow, superficial examination, we find that sentient beings are full of variety and differences and so forth. Now, ultimately, there's no difference between a sentient being or all sentient beings and the Buddha. Mingyur Rinpoche, in the book that we just finished last week, describes his experience after the Bardo experience. And he describes it this way, that I and the Buddha are not one and not two, neither separate nor indistinguishable, beyond both. The Buddha is not dead, and Mingyur Rinpoche is not alive, that they are both beyond birth and death. So this is the idea that the Karmapa is trying to convey to us in this book. So he uses clay as an example, that clay can be used to make a Buddha statue, or it could be made to make a statue of a pig. And well, the Buddha statue will elicit respect and devotion, maybe even making offerings to it on a daily basis, praying to it, and so forth. We wouldn't do that to a pig statue. Yet the clay is the same. So deep underneath it all sentient beings have this Buddha nature. And that is the point that he is trying to convey to us about why we need to treat all sentient beings with respect. And is more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, is more precious than our money, than our possessions. And it is through them that we will accomplish Buddhahood. And so we need to always hold beings dear, dearly, and so forth. Let me see here. So he finishes up the chapter by saying, we make offerings to the Buddhas and accomplish benefit to sentient beings so that we can attain Buddhahood. That it's most important to consider Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and he uses the term gods, but we also need to recognize all sentient beings, that sentient beings have qualities and we need to cherish them.